All right, so that is a classic SNL skit. My thanks to Aaron. He had to dig deep to find that. It's one that lived in 12-year-old Giuseppe's brain for a long time. So we're talking about the story of the rich man and Jesus. This is a powerful story. It both unsettles and inspires. It is said that after hearing this story, St. Francis of Assisi, who began his life very wealthy, he had inherited a great deal of wealth from his family, donated everything he had and dedicated himself in service to others. Unsurprising, this story has also been argued over by theologians and preachers for centuries. Now, last week we talked about the theme of greatness in the Gospel of Mark, especially how we see it in chapters 9 and 10. And Jesus says repeatedly that those who seek to be great in the kingdom of heaven must be the servant of all. Those who desire to be first must be last. In the world that God desires, the marginalized are centered, and those that society centers are pushed to the margins. And what we have through this swirling activity is supposed to be equity, to put a modern term on it. And you know what we have in the middle of Jesus' teachings about greatness? We have this story. Now, I've heard this most often ripped entirely out of its context, and I think when we do that, we lose what Jesus is trying to teach. We lose Jesus' presentation in the book of Mark, and that matters. There's a message in here that I think is worth paying attention to. What does it look like for this person, the rich young man, to participate in the world that God desires? To experience what Walter's translation, what most of our translation calls eternal life. Now, the word used for eternal is this Greek word, aionios. It's a word that we get the word eon from. And what that can mean is for a great extended period of time, perhaps as we think of it, an unending period of time, but that's usually with certain caveats attached to it. It can also mean for an intense experience. So what we have here is the rich young man asking, Jesus, what do I need to do to experience abundant life? Life so full, so abundant, that it overflows from this world, from this life, into the world to come. That's, in my understanding, as I study this word, the best that I can arrive at. And that can mean how many of us think of eternal, but it doesn't start after we die. It starts here. It's now. It's a very now-centered question that he's asking. So, Jesus asks him, well, have you done the commandments? He has in mind the 10 commandments, and he lists 6 in particular. Now, Jesus has summed this up elsewhere as love God and love neighbor as you love yourself, right? And so we tend to understand the 10 commandments as being, there's 4 that deal with God over here, that's on one tablet, and then the other tablet, there's 6, and they deal with loving other people. But the ones that Jesus lists here are the love other ones. It's the love others commandments. And you could just picture this man smiling when he says to Jesus, "Oh, those. Yeah, I've done those since I was a kid." Jesus looks at him, loves him, and says, "One thing you lack. Sell everything you have and give the proceeds to the poor, and then come follow me." This is a troubling text, right? How do we deal with this? And the rich man, what does he do? He leaves, greatly troubled because he had many things. Participating in the kingdom of God, as Jesus talks about it in the book of Mark, the beloved community, it looks like doing more than just what society or religion expects of us. It's about more than being pious or having a good reputation. It's about forsaking grandiosity and privilege and comfort and wealth for the sake of the public good. Now, when Jesus finishes this interaction with the rich man, he turns to his disciples and he says, "Truly, I tell you, it is harder for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to enter the eye of a needle." Now, I've heard a lot of things about what this means. I'm going to get into a few of them here. Raise your hands, too, if I land on one that you've also heard. So, here's option number one. Well, you see, in Jerusalem, there was a gate. It was called the Eye of the Needle. And so camels would have to get down on their knees, as camels love to do, and then squeeze through that gate. And so what Jesus is saying is the rich have to humble themselves. Anybody hear this one? All right, yeah. I was greatly troubled to find out that is not true. Or if it is, we have no proof of it. Maybe one day archaeologists will uncover this gate. It has not been found so far, nor do we have any documents saying so. There's stuff I like about that. I like the idea of humility, right? It's just not quite what Jesus is talking about that we know of, unless we find that gate. So if some of you are looking for a special project. Now, Jerusalem is one of the most heavily, I was going to use archaeological like a verb, but that doesn't exist. Investigated is a better word. Locations in the world for archaeological discoveries. So it would be quite surprising for them to find it, but they do find things all the time over in the Jerusalem area. Okay, so option number two. Option number two is C. What Jesus is saying is that wealth can be a distraction from God. And so, what Jesus is saying is, give your money to the church, to my church, to our ministry in particular, especially our TV ministry. Give, 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 so you're not distracted. Trust in Jesus, and you will be abundantly blessed. How many of you have heard this? Can wealth be a distraction? Absolutely. I think Jesus would agree with that part. I don't see anything in the text that's talking about the second part. Unless the church is some sort of body that's redistributing all of this wealth to those who need it. Now, are most of our churches doing this? I love our church very, very much. Are we redistributing wealth? No. So if you ever see me come up here and use this passage to encourage you to give, I hope you can stop me and say, I don't think that passage is actually saying that, Giuseppe. We do good things here. I'm proud of our community and what we're doing. But this passage is not talking about your offering to the church. And I can't use it that way. All right, option number 3. Option number 3 is, well, you see, what happened is Jesus looked right into the soul of this gentleman, and he saw what keeps him in particular away from dedicating his full self to God. And for this young man, wealth had become an idol. So Jesus is calling out the specific idol that he's struggling with. This is not something we all have to contend with. Jesus is neutral when it comes to wealth, is a common position taken. Have you heard this? All right, I heard this one a lot. I don't think it's that either. If it is, it would have really been nice for Mark to tell us. But Mark does not tell us that Jesus looked into the heart of this young man. Which brings me to option 4, and this is the position I take. What if Jesus meant what he said? What if, as Mark tells the story, and we have to remember all of our gospel writers have a slightly different perspective, or sometimes a greatly different perspective, on Jesus. They emphasize different points. And to Mark and Matthew and Luke, who end up relying on Mark as a source, Jesus has a dim view of wealth. Just like he has a dim view of greatness. Greatness, status, Jesus has said in this entire section, can be such a huge encumbrance to the beloved community of God. So perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that wealth, too, can be a great encumbrance to experiencing the beloved community of God. Now, this gobsmacks the disciples. And you might wonder, why does this gobsmack them? We know they are not particularly wealthy. Most of them cannot read or write. They could not, they were not specially educated. Why? Because they did not come from families where they could afford to be specially educated. There might be an exception made for Levi or Matthew, because he's a tax collector. He at least is doing math on paper and keeping records. So if the rest of these guys, these 12, if they can't even afford to read and write and get special training in that way, if they're out busting their backs every single day, fishing, which is hard work even now, right? Why are they taken aback by this? It's because in their society, the wealthy are held as being very important, and they are seen as being specially blessed by God. A prevailing perspective is that God rewards those in this life for the good that they do. And we still have a lot of that in American culture. We inherit that from our Puritan roots. That what we have must be a reflection of God's blessings and rewards for us. Now, for a lot of us, we might view this as unsettling, bad news. But I want to point out that this wasn't written to us directly. Mark's audience, and I've said this a few times, I'm going to say it again now, and some of you are going to be like, oh, this again. Mark's audience is overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly marginalized. And I don't mean that they are marginalized because they're being persecuted for being Christians. That's not what I'm referring to. I mean, they entered the community impoverished. They were majority slaves. This is a world where 50% of the Roman population are enslaved. They were in a world where women and children could not talk unless given permission to, where men had say-so over their lives unless they were engaged in sex work. Up to 80% of the early church around this time period were women. And part of what we see in all of that is we have slaves and we have women as leaders in the early church. Not just deaconesses who are like doing the dishes, which is very important, holy work, right, Donna? If you ever want to help with such a thing, please talk to Donna. We could always use it. But also preachers, pastors, elders. One, Junia, was an apostle. To these folks, I think this passage was good news. It was good news. And here's what I mean. The book of Acts tells us in the 2nd chapter that when the wealthy would join the early church, at least the one in Jerusalem, many of them would sell what they have and give the proceeds to the poor. The poor in their community in particular. Now, this is a church that was involved in redistributing funds. They would pool assets together, and they would live off of that. So when you had somebody take a passage like this seriously, and they saw their stuff, their things, getting in the way of the public good, of those that they called family, their spiritual siblings, they were participating in the miraculous by selling their stuff and sharing it. Jesus says to the disciples when they say, surely this is impossible, Jesus says, yeah, this would be impossible. But it's not impossible for God. So what we see happening here, I'm convicted. What we see is the wealthy participating in the miraculous activity of God. And we have those with lesser means participating in the radical activity of God, the miraculous activity of God, by sharing all things in common, by doing what they can together, by not letting their possessions, their wealth, their rights stand in the way of what is good for others. Now, have you ever seen this happen in your life? Have you ever seen other folks participating in the miraculous activity of God through radical care for their community? Yeah. Yeah. And I don't use that word miraculous lightly. What I mean is participating with the divine, with the God of love, with the God who is so concerned with what's going on in our world, that they would challenge this church to dedicate some of their resources for the sake of others, even when other people get upset. that God would challenge those who are wealthy to give up some of what they have so that others may live. That the Presbyterian Church, the region in our area, would be willing to give up a $2 million building so that indigenous people in our area who happen to not have a home can have transitional shelter. This stuff is happening all around us, and we get to participate in it. And that's miraculous to me. I know it's tiring sometimes. And I had a recent reminder of how tiring it can be, which brings me to an invitation I have for all of you. See, originally, this is where I was going to end my message, but something came up. I've been working with Emerge and some asylum seekers from Venezuela, singles and families including very little children, some around Emmy's age. For those who don't know, my daughter Imogen is 15 months old. Asylum seekers are in emergency shelters, many of them, around 100 right now, and they are facing a housing cliff. What I mean by that is this Easter, March 31st, while we're going to be celebrating Easter dinner, these folks are going to be preparing to sleep outside. They're going to lose their emergency shelter beds. And this doesn't include families with very young children. They're prohibited from staying in these shelters anyway. So they're already on the streets, many of them. So this brings me to the invitation. Emerge is creating a campaign to pressure Multnomah County into providing safe spaces for our neighbors to be at night and during the day. And we've been invited to participate in this campaign. So I hope you can consider supporting this effort by joining us at the Multnomah building for county meetings, Thursdays at 9:30 until Easter. Now, I know not all of us can do that, but for those of us who can, I hope you can show up. Now, you may be thinking, I can't do that. Or maybe I can, but surely there's something more I can do. So I'm going to bring up a few different things that could also be very helpful. Organizations like Emerge are already pushing themselves to the financial limit. Some are taking on credit debt that they've never had to take on before to house some of these families in motels. And this was not something they were planning on doing, a year or 2 years ago. We had the Welcome Center back then. That got shut down back in 2023. If you happen to have space and a desire to do so, consider being a host. There's individuals, some are young men. There's also families. Now you might be thinking, I can't do that, and I can't come at 9:30. What else needs to happen? Well, there's also a need for transportation. And there's a need for translation if you happen to speak Spanish. If these happen to be things that you would be interested in or capable of doing, please talk to me. Email me. I'm going to ask you to pray it over first, think it over first. I don't want you to say yes right now, and then 2 months into it, you have a family, and you're like, I never wanted to do this. I just felt really compelled in the moment. I think that would be harmful. So think it over and pray it over first, okay? There's one last way. This is the easiest way if you happen to have the financial freedom to do so. You can give money directly to Emerge's Sanctuary Fund. You can do that by going to their webpage, and this is also going to be mentioned in the Crier newsletter article, which is probably going to come out tomorrow. You can find Emerge by Googling IMIRJ or emerge.com. This is what greatness looks like in the eyes of Jesus. Showing up for our marginalized neighbors in need, even though it may be inconvenience, even though it may cost us something. This is an opportunity to participate in the miraculous, investing ourselves in the lives of others instead of our own self-importance. This is the way of abundant aionios life, which we experience now and ripples into the world to come. May we all be busy pursuing the best for and with our neighbors however we can, and through that, also experience the love of our God who invites us into such work.